Welcome, fellow YouTubers. Today we're going to look at the Citation S550 by Carenado. Let's have a look at this beautiful airport with hand-placed objects. It's made by Belga 12345. That's BELGA 12345. There's a lot of activity at the airport, and we've just been fueled, and we're just about ready to go inside and see what's going on. All right, let's take care of all of our static stuff. We're ready to fire up the aircraft. Put our ground power unit in place, and we'll go inside the cockpit of this nicely modeled aircraft. And the battery's already on, as you can hear. We'll move to do a little bit of change here. That's loud enough, I believe. All right, I'm going to start my clock, so I'll march through this in hopefully about 15 minutes. We'll be through the systems and utilization of the center stack here. This is part 2. And we're going to basically be covering from the compass all the way down to the flight director and the trim controls for the rudder for y'all. All right, these 2 orange balls and 1 white ball are used for alignment so that when the pilot's sitting in the proper position, he can be in the right position to see the aircraft and fly the aircraft properly, to put his eyes at the right place to deal with everything. Of course, this is your wet compass. You always want to make sure that your wet compass is aligned with your heads-up display. Just to give us some more stuff to play with, we're going to put on our AC. Boy, oh boy, more fans. More fans. All right. Right below the wet compass is your fire bottles and your activation to arm switch. You would lift the cover off as I've done there. You would arm it, and then when the fire light would be red, if there's a thermocouple that's lit up on that engine, you can discharge bottle 1 and see if the red light goes out, which means that the excess heat has been controlled. If not, you would go over to fire bottle 2 and fire that one. That, of course, would eliminate all of your in-flight fire bottles, but once you have pushed the fire button, you lose all of the outboard, everything outboard of the cutoff into the nacelle of the engine that's selected will not be functional. Okay, before you do your takeoff every day, you would put your thrust reversers out, and you would hit the emergency stow buttons, which will take them back from being stowed to back in position for regular use. So we go back inside the cockpit and reposition ourselves, but then you would go back and turn the switches back to normal. But you saw the sequence. You get an armed unlock and deploy light once you've touched down. You don't want to move the lever, and in fact you can't move the lever until the deploy switches are done. This, of course, is not very well modeled by Carenado because, unfortunately, on the ground when the aircraft spawns, the thrust reversers are deployed, and you can close them with no electricity on and no residual pressure in the hydraulic system, which is, of course, incorrect. There's the microphone right there that picks up the voices of the pilots. It's closer to the captain's side so that you can differentiate between the voices speaking. One will be further muted and one will be more prominent. And then you go down into the engine gauge section. It's divided between tapes, vertical tapes, and digital readouts. The first one on the left is the fan N1, and also down below digitally. Next to that is the ITT, or the inner turbine temperatures, But once you fire off the engine, it gives you a temperature next to the fire can to let you know. Next to that is the fuel flow, which when you do your start sequence, you'll see turbine movement first, which this is your turbine gauge. Digital, it doesn't have a tape. Once you see that, you'll see fuel flow, and then eventually you'll see some ITT rise as a secondary indication. You'll see fan speed and your pressure light go out, and then you want to scan your gauges. When you hit 40% turbine, you'll hear a loud click. The white light in the starter button, which is over here, will go out at 40% N2. Okay. And then again, there's your oil temp and oil pressure and your fuel quantity switches. Below that is your annunciator panel, which will show you the different features, such as you retract your spoilers. You'll see the light go out there momentarily when the spoilers have stowed. These all have to do with different features. You'll have some icing that will come on in flight, but basically when you leave the ground, you should have all of those lights extinguished, or you're carrying an emergency into the air. There's your DME readout and some other readouts for items that when they come into play, they will illuminate there. And your standby gyro. Next to that, below that, is the altitude select, the heading select, pre-select. So you put your altitude in there. I'm using plane command today, so I can show you. Set altitude 6,000.
Altitude 6,000 feet.
All right, coming down, and again, that's your standby attitude. That will be on in the emergency position on your battery switch. So if you're flying along, you have an emergency electrically related, you will turn the battery off, or basically down to emergency. With the generators running, you would have all of the electrical systems at your disposal, but the battery would be offline, which is a way to cool it down, which you would be looking at this. If it got into the yellow or red over here, you need to take it offline so it can cool, so it doesn't thermally melt down. All right, moving on, this is your nav weather display, where you can put on your weather, your terrain modes, including TAWS, which is showing basically you're going to run into everything at the altitude you're currently occupying. Normal flight, you probably wouldn't need that to be on. Got your wind indicator here with the wind speed, your TCAS, and some nav features that as yet I haven't seen how they do anything. And you can change from compass rose to full compass. And your range button, you should push the one farthest away for your nose, meaning that you're extending the range, but they're actually reversed. This one should say closer and that one should say farther away, but they're reversed and incorrectly modeled in this aircraft. Okay, when you turn on your AC power and your inverters, these lights should be stowed in the on position. Transponder on.
Transponder is on.
Transponder 1200.
Transponder set to 1200.
So again, you get those. I just include the transponders in the central pack because it's with the radio stack. Okay, moving down now, we'll get into the central panel, but there's your indicator lights and your gear unsafe lights, your anti-skid, which should be turned on when the aircraft is not moving, and your gear horn silencer. In other words, if you're doing the rotary test switch, this should be able to mute that. It's not so modeled in this aircraft. And of course your gear lever. Let's set up and get ready for the central panel here on top of the pressurization environmental systems. And I've pushed the wrong button, but fortunately it comes right back to where I had it before. Now then, This gauge is your cabin pressure and ultimate altitude. The inner green ring tells you your pressure differential in pounds per square inch. So when the short needle comes around, it's going up to your maximum of 8.9 psi, cabin differential between the outside of the cabin and how much pressure is on the inside. And basically, if you were to leave this at 1,000 feet, selected here as 1,000 feet, it would maintain that pressure of 1,000 feet cabin altitude, which is the outer ring, until you got to the maximum differential of 8.9. This tells you your cabin feet per minute rise, which is controlled by this switch. Generally, you want to stay in the 1,000 feet per minute, so that as the cabin's going up, you have a flood cooling button that will help to cool the aircraft. There, this is your emergency dump that you don't want to have to use unless you really need to, but the smartest way to do that is turn your source selector from manual to off, and it will leak down much slower and be much kinder to your passengers and your own eardrums, especially at altitudes above 39,000 feet. You'll get a loud bang and a vapor cloud that forms inside the cockpit. But again, once you've started both engines, you want to turn your pressure source selector to normal. In the older aircraft, it would say both. You can now control the temperature either auto, or you can switch it to manual and then power it hot or cold with this button. This should be a 3-position switch, but unfortunately it's only modeled as a 2-position switch, which is not accurate. This is your cabin bias or cabin flow. You can set, for takeoff and landing, you should bias it towards the cockpit to help clear the windshields. It's much more important than you see than the passenger seeing. All right, now we move down to the throttle quadrant, and I'm going to go to another position and then zoom in. Okay, you can move the trim wheel with your mouse. You want to be towards the T for takeoff so that it doesn't rotate automatically as you're rolling down the runway. Your flap selector is here, and you move that manually, and the follower is physically connected to the flaps themselves. So in other words, when the flaps have moved to that position, it indicates it. The other thing is, you're not going to ever run into a situation where the flaps would split. They are bolted together both sides. If one side has something that will not allow it to move, it will basically blow the circuit breaker for the flap actuation. And they are electrically actuated and hydraulically moved. So now we move into the thrust levers. And for starting purposes, we have a throttle latch on both sides. That's basically a J hook. And when you pull that up, I'll demonstrate. You move them off the bottom, you pull and hold this up and move the throttle up, and you hear it click, and now you see that throttle is now up in position above the bar that prevents it from going to shut off. And then you can click and hold it again, and then move it back, release it, and it's back to cut off. These are the thrust lever for both engines. So in other words, if you want to do thrust reverse, that's what you would pull. However, as you can see, they're moving on the ground in the off position. You cannot do that, and you cannot do that in flight to move them. The reason for that is there's a squat switch on each landing gear that reports weight on the wheels. And the left side tells it not to deploy the thrust reversers in flight. And unfortunately, Carenado probably has never had anybody advising them that has flown in the airplane, so they would not know that. Another feature that is very important is that when the throttles are advanced to 85%, that will automatically retract the spoilers. And you'll just see now by going to full throttle, and it does not retract the throttle, it does not retract the speed brake, so it's not modeled correctly. But we intend to pass these little items on to Carenado so that they understand it needs to be corrected. New flap settings on this particular aircraft are 7, 20, and 35. Okay, we move down, and before we get to the FMS, we've got 5 more minutes left in our 5-minute primer. There's your gated speed brake actuation button to extend or retract or neutral. And again, this is it's a 3-position switch with momentary hold. In other words, you would push it up and it would come right back to the center, or push it down and it would come right back to the center. This is incorrectly modeled. Okay, we have the fan and turbine switch, and what this does is synchronize the right engine to the master engine, which is the left engine. And it depends on what you hear. There is a light that illuminates to show you that you've got that on, which I don't believe works. It does not. All right, that concludes the throttle quadrant. Now we'll move into the FMS and other features below. You can pop this particular one out. In this case, I'll go back up to an outside view, but now if you click in the field with the brackets, you'll notice it's now blinking. You can use your keyboard to type in your waypoints and information into the flight plan. And you click on it again and it becomes stationary, and you can hide it and it goes back into the normal position. The use of this particular FMS is modeled also in the Carenado glossaries, and it's also in X-Plane. It's very well documented. I'm not going to cover that. Down below we have the left and right side course indication buttons that can be pushed to sync, and a heading bug that works on both sides. You turn on your Flight Director, and then you would select either HSI or via HSI or GPS. Push altitude select, which is going to arm your altitude, which will be in yellow, and now it's going to, you have to fly it to by vertical speed or indicated airspeed. VNAV I have not tried in this aircraft. I do not know if it works, but that's the basic function. You can of course move these armrests up, and I recommend that you do that if you want to use it from the overhead position. Your vertical speed is controlled here, and you simply wheel this back. You can go up to your panel and check your IVSI, and guess what? There's a magenta caret that tells you your selected rate of climb. And if you do not select, this is a key feature, if you leave the heading unselected and look at the command bars, they will command you 10 degrees nose up and no heading reference, because as you'll see, the caret is not on the heading that we're now setting. So you can take off on runway heading a line, pitch it up to 10, and if ATC immediately tells you to turn, or you know a heading you're going to, you can go down and select heading and make that turn in one movement, because once you're balancing the radio and all the features, especially single pilot, it becomes much more difficult to take care of all these items. And again, here's the switch where you would select GPS or heading HSI. And back here is your yaw control for your rudder, your autopilot switch, your yaw damper switch, bank limit, soft drive, and as I said, this is your pitch for vertical speed. And you can, of course, in any other mode, you can turn the aircraft by moving this to turn the aircraft to an unspecific heading from the heading bug. But now that pretty much concludes the center panel console. I hope that it's been been useful for you to advise you of things that you need to know in this aircraft. And so we'll go back outside and look at our wonderful aircraft and know that we're set to go. Stay tuned for part 3. I'll show you the co-pilot's panel, and as necessary we'll do additional features. But thanks for stopping by. Like and subscribe, and if you have any suggestions, put them in the comments and I'll try and cover them for you in future episodes. But have a great day. Thanks for stopping by. This is YouTube saying, and Jagjet saying, life goes on within you and without you.